They walked in like any other young couple, just looking for a new car. But when the slick salesman saw them, he saw an easy target, someone he could squeeze for every last dollar. What he didn't know, the man sitting across from him wasn't just another customer. He was the one person who could destroy his entire career. And when the truth came out, let's just say, he never saw it coming. The afternoon sunlight poured through the showroom's massive glass windows, casting a golden glow over the pristine vehicles on display. Royce Auto, one of New York's most prestigious car dealerships, exuded an air of luxury and exclusivity. The faint hum of soft jazz played in the background, blending with the quiet murmur of potential buyers admiring their next status symbol. Ethan Carter stepped through the entrance, his presence unassuming. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and well-worn jeans, he looked no different from an everyday customer, a stark contrast to the power he actually wielded. By his side, Emma Carter's eyes sparkled with excitement as she scanned the showroom, her appreciation for fine craftsmanship evident in the way she lingered near the newest models. A sharply dressed salesman approached, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. Ryan Henderson had built a reputation at Royce Auto for closing high-value deals, often at the expense of the less financially savvy. His sharp gaze assessed the couple instantly, noting Ethan's casual attire, Emma's enthusiasm, and the absence of any visible luxury accessories that might signal wealth. "Afternoon, folks," Ryan greeted smoothly, flashing a well-practiced smile. "Looking for something special today?" Emma gestured toward a sleek Royce LX 500, her voice brimming with admiration. "This one, it's beautiful." Ryan's eyes flickered with recognition. This was one of their premium models. A high commission, if played correctly. He nodded approvingly, as if giving them permission to admire the vehicle. "Ah, excellent choice. The LX 500 is one of our top performers. But, I have to tell you, demand is sky high. We only have a couple left in stock." Ethan, hands casually in his pockets, studied the car's sleek lines before glancing at Ryan. "What's the price on this?" Ryan barely hesitated before quoting a number, 15% higher than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Emma's expression faltered slightly. "That seems a little above the listed price on your website," Ethan remarked, his voice neutral. Ryan let out a short, condescending chuckle. "Oh, that's just a base estimate. A marketing price to get people in the door. It doesn't reflect actual availability. Cars like these go fast, and the real price adjusts based on demand." Ethan met Ryan's gaze evenly. "So, you're saying the official pricing is misleading?" Ryan waved a dismissive hand. "Not at all. Think of it like a flight ticket. The earlier you book, the better the deal. Right now, with the market the way it is, these cars are practically selling themselves." He leaned in slightly. "If you wait, you might end up paying even more. Imports are getting harder to secure." Emma exchanged a glance with Ethan, a silent question passing between them. Ethan, unfazed, tilted his head. "Sounds like quite the situation. Any room to negotiate?" Ryan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. But this time, it carried an edge of amusement. "Negotiation? At this level? Listen, I can see you appreciate quality. But we don't haggle here like it's a used car lot. If you're looking for discounts, you might want to check out our pre-owned section." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line, but Ethan remained composed. He studied Ryan for a beat longer, then let out a thoughtful hum. "All right, if that's the best you can do, let's move forward with the paperwork." Ryan blinked, momentarily thrown off. Most customers in this situation either walked away or continued arguing. He hadn't expected compliance so easily. Recovering quickly, he plastered on his salesman's grin. "Smart decision. You won't regret it." As they moved toward the sales desk, Ethan took the offered contract and skimmed through the document. His eyes landed on a particular clause buried in fine print, a seemingly minor line that drastically altered the final price structure. A clear manipulation, without a flicker of emotion. He picked up the pen and signed. The VIP transaction room at Royce Auto was designed to impress. Dim, golden lighting reflected off polished walnut tables, and the plush leather chairs exuded an air of exclusivity. This was where the dealership's most expensive deals were closed, where numbers were whispered rather than printed, and where profit margins stretched far beyond the reasonable. Ethan Carter sat with Emma by his side, their demeanor calm, unreadable. Across from them, Ryan Henderson wore the grin of a man who believed he had just pocketed his biggest sale of the month. The signed contract lay before him, his fingers tracing over the inked signature as though it were a trophy. "Congratulations," Ryan announced, his voice dripping with triumph. "You've just secured one of the last Royce LX 500s on the market, at an incredible deal." "No less." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. But Ethan remained unfazed. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and tapped a few keys. A quiet ping followed, an email sent. Ryan's smile faltered. Something about Ethan's demeanor unsettled him now. Though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had seen plenty of hesitant buyers. But this wasn't hesitation. This was something else. Before he could dwell on it, the door swung open, and Michael Reed stepped in. His stride confident, his handshake firm as he clapped Ryan on the back. "Well done," Michael praised, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Another premium sale. You keep this up, and I'll have to start giving you my office." Ryan forced a laugh, still eyeing Ethan cautiously. Something wasn't right. The customer sitting before him, the one he had been so sure was just another naive buyer, was too composed, too controlled. Ethan finally spoke, his voice carrying a deliberate weight. "It's fascinating," he mused, leaning back slightly, "seeing firsthand how my company operates." Ryan blinked, his expression shifting. "Your company?" Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a sleek, embossed business card on the table. The Royce Auto logo gleamed under the dim lights, followed by a single name and title, Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer. Silence fell like a hammer. The color drained from Ryan's face as he registered the reality of the situation. Michael's confident smirk dissolved into a blank stare. Around them, a few employees discreetly glanced at one another, whispering behind their hands. Ethan let the silence stretch before speaking again, his tone controlled, but sharp enough to cut. "You just sold me a vehicle at an inflated price, using deceptive tactics. Is this standard practice at Royce Auto?" Michael was the first to recover, though his voice was suddenly less certain. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This is just..." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "A new sales strategy?" He gestured toward the camera mounted in the corner of the room. "I assume that's been recording all our interactions?" Michael's jaw tightened. Ryan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly as if resisting the urge to grab the contract and tear it apart. Ethan exhaled softly, shifting his focus to the employees now frozen in the doorway, their curiosity outweighing their fear of being caught watching. "I want a full audit of this dealership," he stated, his voice carrying enough authority to leave no room for debate. 6 months' worth of transactions. Now, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, hesitantly, a younger employee, barely in his mid-20s, stepped forward, clutching a thick folder to his chest. His name tag read Kevin Morales, and his face was drawn with something between nerves and quiet determination. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Sir, you might want to see this." Ethan took the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the documents, moving methodically until they landed on a series of nearly identical transactions, each marked with the same inflated surcharges, the same fabricated fees, the same tactics Ryan had used on him. One page after another, customer after customer. Ethan's grip on the paper tightened slightly. His gaze lifted, locking onto Ryan, then Michael. "Well?" His voice was quiet, deadly. Ryan swallowed, but no words came. Michael, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. The air in the manager's office felt thick, weighed down by the tension radiating from every corner. Outside the glass walls, showroom employees pretended to be busy, but their eyes kept darting toward the confrontation unfolding inside. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the sleek mahogany desk, his expression unreadable, while Ryan Henderson and Michael Reed sat across from him, their postures stiff. Without a word, Ethan reached into the folder in his hand and flicked his wrist. A stack of documents scattered across the desk, some sliding onto the floor. Rows of figures, transaction records, and invoices, each one carrying the unmistakable stain of fraud. The rustling papers were the only sound in the room for a long moment. Ryan was the first to react. He straightened his shoulders and forced a smirk. but his fingers twitched against his lap. "This is just how business works," he said, voice carefully measured. "We optimize revenue. Customers sign the contracts willingly. No one forces them." Michael Reed let out a slow exhale, keeping his hands clasped together on the desk. His usual confidence was faltering, but he still clung to the illusion of control. "We follow company policy," he added, though his tone lacked conviction. "If adjustments are needed, we can always revisit certain transactions." Emma Carter, standing a few steps behind her husband, flipped through one of the contracts Ethan had laid out. Her brows knit together as she scanned a specific page, her jaw tightening. She turned the document toward Michael, tapping a highlighted section. "Then tell me why this couple, both in their 70s, were charged an extra $5,000 for an extended warranty they never requested." Michael opened his mouth but hesitated. From the side of the room, Lisa Grant shifted uncomfortably. The young accountant had been standing quietly, clearly torn between fear and duty. Finally, she took a step forward, voice hesitant but firm. I actually tried to report this," she said. "6 months ago, I flagged irregularities in the pricing models and sent an email about it." Ethan turned his head toward her, sharp gaze locking onto hers. "And what happened?" Lisa swallowed, glancing nervously at Michael. "I was told not to overstep," she admitted. "Mr. Reed said it was just part of our," she hesitated, as if struggling to find a neutral term, "business strategy." Ethan held out a hand. "Do you still have that email?" Lisa hesitated only a second before pulling out her phone, swiping quickly until she reached a specific message. She tapped the screen a few times and then turned it toward Ethan. The subject line alone was damning. Irregular fees in client transactions, do not escalate." He took the phone from her, reading the message carefully. The contents were exactly what he expected, an internal directive from Michael Reed himself, instructing her to process as directed and not question the pricing discrepancies. Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Then, without a word, he set Lisa's phone down, reached for his own, and made a call. He placed it on speaker, the dial tone cutting through the silent room. The call connected. A measured voice came through. "This is Daniel Lawson, Corporate Legal Affairs. What can I do for you, Mr. Carter?" Ethan didn't take his eyes off Michael and Ryan. "I'm authorizing a full-scale internal audit of Royce Auto's financial records," he said, effective immediately. Ryan's face drained of color. He sputtered. You can't do that." I was just following." Ethan tilted his head. "Following orders? Then I suppose we'll see just how many orders match this pattern. Won't we?" Michael's fingers curled into a fist on the desk. He looked toward Ryan as if expecting him to do something, say something, but Ryan was too frozen in place to react. Then the glass doors of the office swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, their presence radiating quiet authority. The badges clipped to their lapels bore the insignia of Royce Auto's Corporate Investigative Division. Michael slumped slightly in his chair, shoulders sagging as realization settled over him. The storm had arrived. The conference room at Royce Auto was smaller than the main showroom floor but designed for high-stakes discussions. A sleek glass table stretched across the room, surrounded by leather chairs that had likely witnessed their fair share of tense negotiations. Today, however, the stakes were different. This wasn't about closing deals, it was about exposing deception. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the table, arms crossed as James Connor, the head of internal investigations, scrolled through financial records on his laptop. The room was silent except for the rhythmic clicking of keys as the data loaded. Across the table, Ryan Henderson sat rigid, his foot tapping anxiously beneath the table. Michael Reed, however, remained composed, hands clasped together as if he were merely sitting through an inconvenient meeting rather than a professional reckoning. James let out a low breath, eyes narrowing at the screen. "We've identified over 50 transactions with manipulated pricing," he said. "The pattern is consistent. Customers were charged excessive fees disguised as mandatory add-ons, most of which weren't even part of our standard packages." Ryan's breath hitched. He turned to Michael, voice cracking. I only did what you told me to do." Michael's head snapped toward him, his calm veneer cracking. "You liar," he hissed. "You're the one who pushed for higher markups. Don't act like you weren't pocketing bonuses from these deals. Ryan's face turned pale. His gaze darted toward Ethan, as if searching for some sign of mercy. He found none. Ethan's voice cut through the room, low and measured. You really think I don't know where these orders came from? He reached for the laptop, tilting the screen toward them. The approval for these markups came directly from your company email. Michael stiffened. The mask of control he had worn so well began to slip, replaced by something darker, desperation. That doesn't prove anything, he snapped, rising abruptly from his chair. I've built this branch into one of the most profitable in the company. You need me. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. And in doing so, you've cost Royce Auto millions in legal liabilities. He turned to James. Tell me, what else have we found? James tapped a few more keys before turning the laptop to face Ethan. We've located multiple forged contracts. Every single one includes a hidden kickback, money that was funneled into a private account under a shell corporation. The records link back to Michael. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. He had been caught, and he knew it, but instead of surrendering, his voice lowered into something more threatening. You really think you can fire me? His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smirk. You're making a mistake. This company operates a certain way for a reason. If you try to change that, you'll regret it. Ethan met his glare, unfazed. Michael Reed, you are officially terminated, effective immediately. He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. And I've already reported this to corporate legal. You'll be hearing from them soon. For the first time, Michael faltered. His breathing grew shallow, his eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating an escape. The walls that had once protected him were now closing in. 2 security personnel entered, their presence a silent confirmation of Ethan's decision. As they stepped toward Michael, he let out a bitter laugh. Shaking his head, you think you've won, he muttered, but this system has been in place longer than you've been CEO. You can't erase it overnight. Ethan's expression didn't change. I'm not here to erase it, he replied coolly. I'm here to tear it down. Michael was led out of the room, his footsteps echoing against the tile floor. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, Ryan took his chance. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, typing hastily before slipping it into his pocket. Somewhere across the city, a notification lit up on another screen. A reply came almost instantly. Stay quiet, I'll handle it. Unaware of the silent exchange, Ethan turned his gaze back to the remaining employees. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The tension inside Royce Auto hadn't dissipated after Michael Reed's dramatic exit. If anything, it had only shifted, lingering in the air like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. Employees moved about cautiously, whispering in small clusters, unsure whether they should feel relieved or terrified. Those who had played no part in the fraudulent schemes breathed easier, while others, those who had profited from the deception, kept their heads down, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Ethan Carter sat in his office, the blinds half drawn against the evening sun. His fingers drummed against the desk as he studied the growing pile of reports from the internal investigation. The surface in front of him was littered with financial records, customer complaints, and flagged transactions. Michael Reed might have been removed, but the rot within Royce Auto had clearly spread deeper than just one man. Lisa Grant knocked lightly before stepping in, holding a tablet against her chest. She hesitated before speaking. There's something you need to see. Ethan gestured for her to continue, and she placed the tablet on the desk, swiping through several documents. Someone's been deleting records from the internal accounting system, she said, not just old ones, recent files, too, as if they knew we'd be looking. Ethan leaned forward. How much has been erased? Enough to cover their tracks, Lisa replied, but not enough to make it look like an accident. It's deliberate. Whoever's doing this still has access. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who still had access. Ryan Henderson was pacing inside his office when Ethan entered unannounced. The salesman stopped mid-step, his face briefly contorting into an expression of nervous defiance. I don't have time for this, he muttered, shoving a stack of papers into a drawer. Ethan closed the door behind him, his voice calm. Someone's been erasing financial records. Want to take a guess who that might be? Ryan let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. You think I'm the only one with access? Half the management team could do it. Ethan didn't blink. And yet you're the only one looking guilty. Ryan stiffened but kept up the act. I have nothing to say. Ethan studied him for a long moment before exhaling through his nose. You're running out of time. Ryan. The salesman didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As Ethan turned to leave, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another update from James Connor. But instead, an unknown number flashed across the screen. He answered cautiously. A low, distorted voice came through. You think firing a couple of people will fix this? Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? You know exactly who I am. The voice continued, smooth and controlled. Royce Auto doesn't belong to you alone. You should reconsider how far you're willing to push. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the screen for a second before lowering the phone. His mind raced. This wasn't just about rogue employees or a few bad deals. This was something bigger. Something orchestrated. And if someone thought they could scare him into stopping, they had just made a serious miscalculation. James Connor arrived moments later. A file tucked under his arm. He placed it on Ethan's desk without a word, flipping it open to reveal a list of offshore transactions linked to a single, unregistered bank account. Payments from customers were being siphoned here. James explained. It's a slush fund, untraceable, unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Ethan exhaled sharply. And who controls it? James tapped the paper. Not Reed, someone higher. Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed again, this time. A text from an old name he hadn't heard in years. Mark Sullivan. The former showroom employee had left under unusual circumstances years ago. But now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out. The message was simple. I have something you need to see. Tonight. Ethan didn't hesitate. He texted back, setting a meeting at a cafe downtown. But when he arrived that evening, the seat Mark was supposed to be in remained empty. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. Ethan checked his watch, scanned the cafe one more time, then turned to leave. The city streets outside were alive with the usual noise of evening traffic. But beneath it all, he felt something else. A storm was coming. The city was restless under the glow of streetlights, its energy humming through the cold night air. Ethan sat behind the wheel of his car, parked across from a small cafe where Mark Sullivan was supposed to meet him. The neon sign flickered weakly above the entrance, illuminating the few patrons inside. But the seat Mark should have been in remained empty. Ethan checked the time. 15 minutes late. He reached for his phone and dialed Mark's number again. Straight to voicemail. He exhaled, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, the unease in his gut growing heavier. His phone vibrated in his palm. A new text. The sender was an unknown number. Stop looking for him. Worry about yourself. Ethan's grip tightened around the device. The message was simple, but the implication was clear. Mark wasn't just avoiding him. Someone had made sure he wouldn't show up. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. The street behind him was quiet, but there was an undeniable weight to the air, like he was being watched. He scanned the sidewalk, catching a glimpse of a man in a dark coat standing under a lamppost a block away. The stranger's posture was too still, his gaze directed toward Ethan's car. Ethan turned to get a better look, but in the second it took for him to shift, the man was gone. At the same time, across the city, Ryan Henderson moved frantically inside the showroom's back office. His hands trembled as he shoved files into a duffel bag, stuffing his pockets with anything that might be useful later. He knew time was running out. Michael Reed was already gone, and Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of man to let loose ends stay untied. The door to the showroom creaked open, and Ryan froze. He wasn't expecting anyone this late. Slowly, he peeked out into the showroom floor. The space was empty, but outside, through the glass doors, a black sedan had pulled up to the curb. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but Ryan's pulse spiked. He hesitated for only a second before making a decision. Slipping out the back exit, he broke into a sprint down the alley, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He didn't look back. By the time morning came, no one at Royce Auto would be able to find him. Back at headquarters, Ethan was on the phone with James Connor, his voice edged with frustration. We just lost everything, James said. The financial data, transaction histories, wiped clean in under 5 minutes. Ethan closed his eyes for a beat, trying to contain his anger. How? James sighed, the weight in his voice evident. It was a direct breach into our internal systems. Someone on the inside had access. They knew exactly what to erase. Lisa Grant sat at her desk, pale-faced as she scrolled through the remnants of the company's financial logs. They didn't just delete records, she murmured. They covered their tracks. There's nothing left. A silence stretched between them. Ethan clenched his jaw. Someone was cleaning up the mess before he could expose it, and that meant they weren't just covering for Michael Reed or Ryan Henderson. There was a bigger hand at play, one that had been orchestrating everything from behind the curtain. He turned toward the window, looking out into the city. Somewhere out there, someone had just declared war. The city pulsed outside the apartment windows, neon reflections flickering against the glass. Manhattan never truly slept, but inside Ethan Carter's home office, the noise of the streets felt distant, muffled by the weight of the day's revelations. He sat at his desk, sleeves rolled up, fingers drumming lightly against a stack of reports. The pages before him weren't just numbers and names. They were threads leading back to something larger. Something calculated. His eyes traced the evidence once more. The financial discrepancies stretched beyond what Michael Reed and Ryan Henderson could have orchestrated alone. The money moved too smoothly. The records vanished too cleanly. Someone higher up had their hands in this. Someone powerful enough to erase traces before he could follow them. The vibration of his phone against the desk cut through the quiet. He picked it up, recognizing James Connor's name on the screen. There was an urgency in his voice before Ethan even had a chance to speak. Ryan Henderson is gone, James said, his breath uneven. No one knows where. Security footage at the showroom, gone. The system was disabled right before he left. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Ryan wasn't the type to disappear without a plan. If he had been running, there would have been signs, financial withdrawals, travel records, something. But for him to vanish entirely, without a trace, that meant someone else had pulled him off the board. His mind worked through the possibilities. But before he could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Emma stood in the dim hallway, arms crossed, concern etched into her face. You're pushing too far, Ethan, she said quietly. If they can make Ryan disappear, what's stopping them from coming after you? He met her gaze, seeing the worry beneath her frustration. She wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about financial fraud anymore. It was something deeper. Something designed to stay hidden. And he was tearing through it without knowing who, or what, was waiting on the other side. I can't stop now, he said, voice steady. Not when I'm this close. Emma sighed, stepping closer, lowering her voice. Close to what? You don't even know who you're up against. You're chasing shadows, and they're watching you. The words lingered in the air, heavier than he wanted to admit. Then, the doorbell rang. Ethan's body tensed. It was late, too late for visitors. He pushed back from his desk, moving toward the front door with measured steps. Emma followed a few paces behind, her unease palpable. He opened the door. There was no one there, just the quiet hum of the city, the occasional honk from a distant taxi. But at his feet, lying against the welcome mat, was a black envelope. He bent down, picking it up carefully. The weight of it felt deliberate, almost personal. He stepped back inside, peeling it open with steady hands. Inside was a single photograph. It was him, standing in front of Royce Auto that morning. His jaw tightened as he flipped it over. On the back, in crisp, typed letters, was a single sentence. Know when to walk away. Emma inhaled sharply, reading over his shoulder. Ethan. He didn't let her finish. He set the photo down, his fingers pressing into the edges. His heartbeat was steady, but beneath it was a slow, rising heat. They were watching him, tracking his movements. Someone wanted him to stop. But intimidation had never worked on him before. It wouldn't start now. He turned back to Emma, his voice calm but firm. I need to find out who sent this. The glass doors of Royce Auto's headquarters slid open as Ethan Carter stepped inside. The hum of quiet conversations and clicking keyboards filling the pristine lobby. Everything appeared normal, employees moving with purpose, assistants balancing coffee trays, executives engaged in hushed discussions. But beneath the surface, Ethan could feel it, Someone was watching. Someone had been watching. He bypassed the receptionist and headed straight for the executive floor. James Connor was waiting for him just outside the security office. His brow furrowed as he gestured for Ethan to follow him inside. The room was dimly lit, lined with monitors displaying security feeds from across the building. James had been working for hours, scanning footage, cross-referencing timestamps. "I checked everything," James said, rubbing a hand over his tired face. No sign of who left the envelope. Whoever it was, they knew how to avoid detection. And the security cameras? Cut off right before it happened. Ethan crossed his arms, exhaling slowly. Not just a random threat. Then, someone with resources. James nodded grimly. And someone who doesn't want you digging any further. Before Ethan could respond, Lisa Grant appeared at the doorway, her usual composed expression giving way to something more urgent. She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. "I need to show you something," she said, holding up a folder. "I was running another check on our financials this morning. And something doesn't add up." Ethan followed her down the hall to her office, where she pulled up a series of transactions on her screen. Numbers scrolled in neat columns. But one section was highlighted in red. "This," Lisa said, pointing at a timestamp. "This happened last night. Almost $2 million moved out of our system in a single transaction. No authorization, no approval, just gone." Ethan leaned in, studying the details. The funds had been routed through a network of shell accounts before disappearing completely. If he hadn't looked now, it might have gone unnoticed for weeks, if not months. "This wasn't just fraud," he murmured. "This was extraction." Lisa nodded. "And whoever did it knew the exact moment to strike." Ethan straightened, jaw tightening. He didn't have time to wait. He needed answers now. 30 minutes later, he stepped into the boardroom, the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders. The long mahogany table stretched across the room, lined with members of Royce Auto's leadership. Some looked indifferent, others impatient, but a few, just a few, avoided his gaze entirely. He placed a folder on the table, flipping it open. $2 million disappeared from our system last night, he said, his voice even, measured. "No approval, no oversight. Someone took it, and I want to know who." Silence settled over the room. A few exchanged nervous glances. Then, Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ethan," he said smoothly, "you're spending a lot of time chasing shadows." Ethan didn't move, but his focus sharpened. Richard tapped a finger against the table. "You might be CEO, but don't forget who really controls this company." The room held its breath. Ethan met Richard's gaze, and in that moment, he knew. The person pulling the strings wasn't hiding in some far-off corner of the business. He was sitting right in front of him. The conference room at Royce Auto's headquarters sat high above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline like a silent witness to the battle unfolding inside. The table stretched long and polished, occupied by the most powerful figures in the company. Some leaned forward in quiet anticipation. Others avoided eye contact, their expressions unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, a carefully controlled storm waiting to break. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet measured. He placed a thick folder down in front of him, flipping it open with deliberate precision. His eyes moved across the room, pausing for just a second longer on Richard Coleman, who sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching him with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Around $2 million disappeared from our system last night," Ethan said, his voice steady. "No authorization, no oversight, just gone." A few board members exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. Others kept their gazes locked straight ahead, unwilling to betray emotion. Ethan continued, "Someone in this room knows exactly where that money went." A heavy silence followed. Then Richard let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back as if amused by the whole thing. "Ethan, I think you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. There are transactions that CEOs don't need to concern themselves with. It's how business works at this level." Ethan didn't blink. "I don't think this was business," he said, "and if you have nothing to hide, you won't mind me investigating further." The smirk on Richard's face faded slightly. He leaned forward now, his voice lowering just enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. You really think you understand how this company runs? He asked. Royce Auto isn't just yours to control. You may have the title of CEO, but this board, he gestured to the others at the table, decides your future here. Ethan held his gaze, unflinching. The room wasn't just filled with executives and decision-makers, it was filled with players in a much larger game. One he was only beginning to grasp. This wasn't about a few bad actors manipulating sales. This was about a system built to sustain itself, with deep roots inside the very foundation of the company. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly, glancing at the screen. A message from James Connor. Urgent, we found something on Richard Coleman. Meet me now. Ethan closed the folder in front of him. His movements slow, deliberate. Then he looked back at Richard, who was still watching him with that knowing gaze. Thanks for the reminder, Richard, Ethan said, pushing his chair back. But I'm not the kind of man who's easily controlled. Richard's expression darkened just slightly. He said nothing as Ethan turned and walked toward the exit. But Ethan could feel his stare, sharp and calculating, following him every step of the way. As he stepped out into the hallway, a security guard was waiting. The man hesitated for only a second before handing Ethan a black envelope. Just like the one before, Ethan took it without a word, his pulse steady as he tore it open. Inside was a contract, a confidential agreement, and at the bottom, clear as day, was Richard Coleman's signature. The walls of the Royce Auto Internal Investigation Office were lined with reinforced glass, soundproofed to ensure that whatever was discussed within its confines remained within its walls. Fluorescent lighting cast a cold glow over the heavy steel table in the center of the room, where stacks of documents lay neatly arranged. The hum of the security system filled the silence as Ethan Carter leaned against the edge of the desk. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across from him, James Connor scrolled through a set of financial reports on a monitor, the reflection of numbers flickering across his glasses. Lisa Grant stood beside him, arms wrapped around a folder so tightly her knuckles had turned white. James exhaled, tapping the screen. We traced it. The money didn't just vanish. It was funneled through multiple shell accounts, buried under layers of bogus investments. But the real problem isn't just the $2 million. It's this. He pulled up another file. The numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of dollars had been moving in and out of Royce Auto's financial system for years, hidden in complex transactions that disguised them as research funds, operational costs, and third-party consulting fees. Lisa took over, flipping open a document in her hands. It's not just showroom fraud, she said, her voice edged with disbelief. This is systemic. There are offshore accounts tied to these transfers. Whoever set this up isn't just skimming profits. They're laundering money. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't about dishonest salespeople inflating commissions anymore. This was something else entirely, something calculated, orchestrated, and if the numbers were correct, it had been happening under the company's nose for years. He picked up his phone and dialed. Richard Coleman arrived 20 minutes later. He strolled in without hesitation, wearing a tailored suit that fit as effortlessly as the smirk on his face. He moved like a man with nothing to fear, his confidence unshaken despite the weight of evidence stacked against him. With an air of amusement, he sank into the chair across from Ethan, crossed his legs, and took his time adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. I have to say, he drawled, I'm impressed. You worked fast. Ethan didn't return the pleasantries. He slid a thick folder across the table. This is what we found, he said. Richard didn't even glance down. Instead, he looked Ethan in the eye, as if the papers before him were an afterthought. You've been busy. Ethan's voice remained steady. This is money being funneled through Royce Auto. Millions moving through untraceable accounts. And your name keeps coming up. Richard finally picked up the file, flipping through it lazily, nodding to himself as if he were reviewing a routine budget report. Then, without warning, he tore the papers in half, the sound ripping through the quiet room. He let the shredded pieces flutter onto the table, then clasped his hands together and leaned forward. I warned you, Ethan, he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. There are things in this company that don't concern you. If you were smart, you'd let this go. Ethan didn't flinch. And if I don't? Richard smiled, slow and knowing. Then you won't just be fighting me. The realization settled in Ethan's gut like lead. Richard wasn't acting alone. He wasn't just some corrupt executive siphoning off funds, he was part of something bigger. Something embedded deep within Royce Auto's structure. Richard stood, smoothing down his suit as he turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You have your evidence," he said, "but evidence means nothing if the system itself is built to protect people like me." Ethan watched him leave, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't about a few corrupt deals anymore. It was about dismantling an entire machine. And Richard had just made one thing clear. Ethan wasn't just going after one man. He was going after the system itself. The tension inside the boardroom of Royce Auto was palpable. The air hummed with the weight of expectation. A quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Ethan Carter sat at the head of the table, his posture calm, his fingers interlocked as he watched the members file in one by one. Some exchanged nervous glances, others avoided his gaze altogether. And then there was Richard Coleman, entering last with his usual air of confidence. His smirk barely contained as he took his seat. Ethan had spent the last 24 hours preparing for this. The evidence was airtight, the plan meticulously laid out. His team, James Connor, Lisa Grant, and Emma, had worked through the night, combing through financial records, tracing missing funds, and piecing together the corruption that had infiltrated Royce Auto. They had found more than enough to dismantle Richard's network. Now, all that remained was execution. Lisa was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "What we're about to present concerns the financial integrity of this company," she said, clicking the remote in her hand. The projector flickered to life, illuminating a series of documents on the large screen at the front of the room. These records show multiple unauthorized transactions linked to offshore accounts. The amounts aren't minor. Tens of millions have been funneled through subsidiaries and shell companies. Most recently through a Royce Auto branch in Miami. Ethan leaned forward. "This isn't just fraud, it's corporate-level money laundering." Murmurs rippled through the room. A few board members sat up straighter, concern creeping into their expressions. Others remained impassive, waiting to see where the conversation would lead. Richard let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Ethan, you always were dramatic." He tapped his fingers against the table. "Do you honestly think waving around a few financial reports is enough to turn this board against me?" Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he nodded at Lisa, who clicked to the next slide. A series of emails appeared on the screen, internal communications that linked Richard directly to the missing funds. His name, his directives, all in black and white. A shift in the room. A few members exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Richard, these are your communications. Would you care to explain?" Richard's smirk faltered for only a second before he composed himself. He exhaled sharply, then leaned back in his chair. "This is business," he said, his voice smooth. "Strategic allocations. If we started questioning every financial maneuver this company makes, we'd never get anything done." Ethan didn't let him continue. "You mean if we started questioning, we'd expose the people pulling the strings?" Richard's gaze darkened. He saw it now, the shift in momentum, the doubt seeping into the room. He had been in too many of these meetings not to recognize when control was slipping from his grasp. But he wasn't done yet. With deliberate ease, he reached for his laptop, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen toward the board. The projector flickered again. New documents filled the screen. "This is interesting," Richard mused, feigning curiosity. "Since we're in the business of exposing secrets, let's talk about one of Ethan's." The screen displayed a confidential financial report from several years ago, an internal decision Ethan had made during his rise to CEO. A restructuring effort, one that had resulted in the closure of underperforming branches. It had been necessary at the time, but the fallout had been messy: layoffs, legal disputes, reputational damage. Richard smiled, slow and predatory. "Funny, isn't it? Here we are discussing corporate ethics. And yet, Ethan himself was responsible for eliminating jobs and covering up financial losses." He turned to the board. How convenient that he's suddenly concerned with transparency. A ripple of uncertainty spread across the table. Ethan felt it immediately. The doubt, the hesitation. Richard had played his hand well. Emma, sitting just a few seats away, clenched her jaw, ready to speak, but Ethan raised a hand, stopping her. His eyes stayed locked on Richard. This wasn't over. The boardroom, once a space for calculated discussions, had become a battlefield. The tension was suffocating, hanging thick in the air as Ethan Carter and Richard Coleman stood on opposite ends of the long mahogany table, locked in a silent war of wills. The other board members sat in uneasy silence, some watching intently, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. They knew what was happening here wasn't just about corporate governance anymore, it was about power, survival, and control. Richard tapped his fingers against the polished wood, his expression one of amusement. But there was something else behind his eyes now. Something colder. He had expected resistance from Ethan. But now that it was here, he wasn't just going to sit back and let himself be dismantled. "You know," Richard began, his voice smooth, casual, "I find it interesting that you're so concerned with financial ethics now, Ethan, because the last time I checked, your own past isn't exactly spotless." With a quick movement, he turned his laptop toward the board. The screen projected onto the large monitor at the front of the room. A financial report filled the display, an old one, dating back to Ethan's earlier years at Royce Auto. "Let's talk about this," Richard continued. "A decision made under your leadership. A restructuring effort that resulted in the closure of multiple branches, including one in Seattle that left hundreds unemployed. Would you call that a move in the name of integrity?" A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan kept his expression neutral, but he could feel the doubt beginning to spread. Richard leaned forward. "You like to stand on this moral high ground, acting as if you're the only one looking out for this company. But at the end of the day, you did what you had to do to protect the bottom line. Just like I have." Emma Carter shifted in her seat, her hands clenching against her lap. Lisa Grant shot Ethan a quick glance, waiting for his response. Ethan took his time. He knew this was coming. He had prepared for it. He exhaled slowly, then turned his focus to the board. "That closure," he said evenly, "wasn't a decision I made lightly. And if Richard wants to paint me as some ruthless executive, then he should at least tell the whole story." James Connor, seated further down the table, clicked on his own laptop. A second report replaced Richard's on the screen, this one detailing the financial state of the Seattle branch at the time of its closure. It was riddled with anomalies. There was an internal investigation into that branch before it shut down. Ethan continued, "We found significant financial discrepancies, mismanaged funds, fraudulent contracts, and assets that simply disappeared. That branch wasn't closed to cut costs. It was closed because it had already been bled dry by corruption." Lisa added, "And guess who signed off on a majority of those financial decisions?" The room went still. The next slide appeared on the screen, a set of internal authorizations linked directly to Richard Coleman. Ethan didn't need to say anything else. The documents spoke for themselves. Richard's smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. James didn't stop there. He clicked to the next piece of evidence, an audio recording. The board members stiffened as a voice, unmistakably Richard's, crackled through the speakers. "We move the money through the Miami subsidiary first, then through the consulting firm. By the time it gets back into the books, it's clean. No one's going to look twice." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some stared at Richard outright, their expressions unreadable. Richard's fingers twitched against the table. He could see it, the doubt, the shifting loyalties. The same people who had once backed him without question were now questioning whether he was worth protecting. Ethan rose from his seat, fixing Richard with an unwavering stare. "This ends now," he said. "The evidence is in front of you all. The question is, how many of you want to go down with him?" Richard opened his mouth, prepared to fire back, when a voice interrupted. "I wouldn't be so quick to call it over." A man from the far end of the table stood up, one of the senior board members, a figure who had remained silent through the entire exchange, until now. His presence alone commanded attention. The moment he spoke, the room shifted. Ethan turned to face him, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Because Richard wasn't the only one orchestrating this. There was someone else, someone even higher up, and Ethan had just stepped into a far bigger fight than he'd imagined. The silence in the boardroom had shifted from tense to suffocating. The once murmuring members of Royce Auto's leadership sat frozen, their gazes darting between Ethan Carter and Richard Coleman. Only moments ago, Richard had been on the defensive, the weight of evidence pressing him into a corner. But now, he simply leaned back in his chair, a slow, knowing smile creeping onto his face. Ethan didn't like it. Across the table, Jonathan Pierce, a longtime board member who had remained neutral until now, pushed back his chair and stood. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost condescending. "You think you've won something here, Ethan?" Jonathan said. "That you've uncovered some grand conspiracy and now everything will just fall into place?" He shook his head, letting out a quiet chuckle. "You're chasing shadows." Ethan narrowed his eyes. Jonathan had always been one of the more reserved members of the board, rarely outspoken, never confrontational. But now, the weight behind his words felt different, purposeful, calculated. Jonathan turned, addressing the other members in the room. "Ethan has been blinded by his personal need to control everything," he continued, "and now he wants you all to believe that Richard is some puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes." His gaze flickered back to Ethan. "But the truth is, Royce Auto was never just yours to command." A shift in the room. Some of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, while others kept their expressions carefully neutral. Ethan kept his stance firm. "Then why don't you explain it to me, Jonathan? What exactly am I missing?" Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't have to explain anything," he said simply, "because you're already too late." Lisa Grant, who had been quietly watching from her seat near the end of the table, suddenly stiffened. Her eyes flickered down to her tablet, her fingers rapidly scrolling through something. A second later, she whispered to James Connor beside her, and he immediately turned to Ethan, his expression grim. "Ethan," James said under his breath, "we just ran a secondary shareholder report. Jonathan has been acquiring private shares. He owns nearly 40% of Royce Auto." The revelation landed like a hammer. Ethan didn't let the shock show on his face, but he felt it settle into his chest like a lead weight. He had spent months tracking fraud, unearthing evidence, and following the money trail. But while he had been focused on Richard Coleman, Jonathan Pierce had been making his own moves, silently positioning himself as the most powerful player in the company. Richard, still seated, let out a laugh. "You see, Ethan," he said, gesturing toward Jonathan, "you were so focused on me, so sure that I was the one pulling the strings. But we've been playing this game a lot longer than you." Ethan turned his full attention to Jonathan, who met his gaze without flinching. "If you wanted control of Royce Auto," Ethan said, voice low and even, "why go through all of this? Why hide behind Richard?" Jonathan smirked. "Because while you were busy fighting your little war, I was building an empire." The weight of his words hung in the air. Ethan knew what this meant. He wasn't just dealing with corporate fraud anymore. He wasn't just fighting a corrupt executive. He was fighting an entire system. And now, he would have to rethink everything. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass windows of Ethan Carter's office. But his mind was focused inward, sharpening every detail of his next move. The revelation about Jonathan Pierce had shifted everything. This wasn't just about Richard Coleman anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system of corruption embedded deep within Royce Auto. Ethan had spent years building this company, shaping it into a powerhouse. Now, he had to burn down everything that had been rotting beneath the surface. And he knew exactly where to strike. Lisa Grant sat across from him, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard as she compiled the final set of documents. "We have enough," she said, glancing up at him. "The financial transactions, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, it all leads back to Pierce and Coleman. If we make this public, they won't be able to contain the damage." James Connor leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "The problem is, they know it's coming. Pierce didn't get this far by being careless. He's probably already planning his next move." Ethan exhaled, his mind racing. "Then we move first." He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. The voice on the other end answered within seconds. "This is Carter," Ethan said. "I need this story to hit every major network within the next 12 hours. Print, digital, television, no delays. The voice on the other end hesitated, then responded, "Understood." Ethan hung up, his jaw set. He wasn't going to let Pierce control the narrative. He was going to expose him before he had a chance to retaliate. By the time the sun began to set, Royce Auto's internal communications were flooded with rumors. Something big was coming, and when Ethan stepped in front of the podium that night, every major news outlet was watching. Dozens of reporters filled the press room. Cameras lined the back wall. The weight of expectation pressed down on the room as Ethan approached the microphone. His expression unreadable. He took a breath, then began. For years, Royce Auto has stood as a leader in this industry. But what many of you don't know is that behind the scenes, a select few have used this company as their personal tool for financial gain. A murmur rippled through the audience. Ethan continued, his voice steady. The documents we're releasing today will prove beyond a doubt that members of our board, including Richard Coleman and Jonathan Pierce, have engaged in fraudulent financial activity, embezzling millions while manipulating company records to hide their tracks. Lisa, standing off to the side, sent out the final set of leaked documents. Within seconds, notifications began lighting up reporters' phones. Screens flashed as journalists scrambled to process the information flooding in. Ethan pressed forward. This corruption has not only damaged our company's integrity but has also put the livelihoods of our employees and the trust of our investors at risk. And I won't allow it to continue. A moment of silence hung over the room before a voice cut through the noise. If this is true, a well-known shareholder in the front row stood, his expression unreadable. Then the board must act immediately. We cannot allow corrupt leadership to remain in control. The tide was shifting. Ethan could feel it. But Jonathan Pierce wasn't a man who let control slip so easily. Across the city, in his penthouse office, Pierce watched the press conference on a large screen, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. His face remained calm, but his eyes were sharp. Calculating, he reached for his phone, dialed a number, and waited for the other end to pick up. "It's time," Pierce said, his voice low. "Do it, now." Back at the press conference, just as Ethan was about to present the final piece of evidence, Lisa gasped beside him. "The system," she whispered. "We're losing access." On the massive screen behind Ethan, the financial records that had been displayed for the public suddenly disappeared. Lines of code flashed, numbers flickered and vanished. Within seconds, every shred of digital evidence they had gathered was erased. Gasps filled the room. The reporters, who had been moments away from publishing the biggest financial scandal of the decade, were now staring at blank screens. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, his mind working frantically. This wasn't just an attack, it was a message. Jonathan Pierce had just reminded him that the war was far from over. The hum of computer servers had vanished. The only sounds in the Royce Auto Control Center were frantic whispers and the hurried tapping of keyboards as IT personnel scrambled to regain control. Every screen in the room had gone dark. The servers silenced in a single calculated strike. The attack was swift, precise, and absolute. Ethan Carter stood in the middle of the chaos. His jaw clenched. He had expected retaliation from Jonathan Pierce. But not like this. Lisa Grant burst through the door, breathless, clutching her tablet. "They wiped everything," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "All the records, every transaction, every trace of their financial manipulation, gone." Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to contain his frustration. "How deep?" Lisa shook her head. "All of it. It's not just the main system. They've erased backup servers too. It's as if the fraud never happened." Across the room, James Connor sat in front of a laptop, typing furiously. "I'm tracking the origin of the breach," he muttered, eyes darting across lines of code. "It's bouncing through dozens of proxy servers." But, he stopped, staring at the screen. "But what?" Ethan pressed. James turned to face him. "One of the signals is coming from an external server we flagged earlier. It matches a secure network we suspected was linked to Pierce." Ethan's fists clenched. Jonathan had been prepared for this. He had built an entire infrastructure to protect himself, to erase his crimes at the moment they were exposed. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her files. "Wait," she whispered, then louder, with renewed urgency. "I think I have something." Everyone turned to her. A few months ago, I was running internal audits and saved a redundant copy of Royce Auto's financials to a private cloud drive. She explained. I didn't think much of it at the time. But if I can access it now. Ethan stepped forward. Can you retrieve it? Lisa nodded, fingers flying across her screen. It'll take a few minutes. Before she could finish, the office doors swung open. 4 men in dark suits entered. Ethan recognized them immediately. Jonathan's legal enforcers. The tallest of them, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, stepped forward. His voice was calm, measured. Mr. Carter, I have a court order to confiscate all Royce Auto digital assets and internal documents related to the ongoing financial investigation. Effective immediately. Lisa paled. James stood up from his chair. Ethan held his ground. On what grounds? The man pulled a folder from his briefcase. There are allegations that unauthorized data collection was conducted on Royce Auto's financial systems. We have reason to believe internal documents were illegally obtained. Ethan didn't need to ask who was behind this. Jonathan Pierce had weaponized the legal system against them, turning the investigation against the very people trying to expose him. Lisa's fingers hovered over her keyboard, hesitating. If they confiscated her computer before she could retrieve the data, it would all be over. Ethan's mind raced. They needed a distraction. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Then they went out. The entire office was plunged into darkness. Shouts rang out as employees fumbled in the dark. The backup generators should have kicked in. But they didn't. Someone had cut the power. Jonathan wasn't just playing defense. He was making sure there was nothing left for Ethan to fight with. In the pitch-black room, Ethan whispered to Lisa, "We need that data now." Lisa's screen still glowed faintly. The battery-powered laptop barely functional. "I need 30 more seconds." Ethan's pulse pounded. "Then you have 15. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the Royce Auto headquarters, casting a golden glow against the steel and glass facade. Inside, however, tension still lingered in the air. Employees whispered in hushed voices, their gazes flickering toward the upper floors where the fate of the company was being decided. Ethan Carter stood in the conference room, facing the remaining board members. Just hours ago, chaos had threatened to bury everything he'd worked for. But now the tables had turned. The truth was out. Every major news outlet was running headlines exposing the financial corruption at Royce Auto, complete with leaked documents detailing years of embezzlement, shell companies, and backroom deals orchestrated by Jonathan Pierce and Richard Coleman. The weight of the scandal was too heavy to ignore. Pierce sat at the end of the long, polished table, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Despite the damning evidence, he projected an air of defiance. Across from him, Coleman looked far less composed, his face pale and drawn. The room buzzed with restless energy as a senior shareholder cleared his throat. In light of the overwhelming evidence, we've taken a vote, he announced, his voice firm. Jonathan Pierce, your tenure at Royce Auto is over. Effective immediately, you are removed from the board. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Pierce's face. Perhaps irritation, perhaps amusement. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if he had already prepared himself for this outcome. I see, he murmured, the corners of his lips curling into something resembling a smirk. You all think this is over? He turned his gaze toward Ethan. You may have won today, but let's not fool ourselves. You haven't dismantled the system. You've merely forced it into the shadows. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected resistance, had known that Pierce wouldn't go down without a parting shot. But this time, the power had shifted. I'm not naive, Ethan said, his voice steady. I know people like you don't disappear overnight. But today, you answer for what you've done. And tomorrow, someone else will take your place, someone who won't let greed consume this company from the inside out. Before Pierce could respond, the door swung open. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their presence drawing immediate silence across the room. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, held up an arrest warrant. Jonathan Pierce, she said, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The smirk on Pierce's face didn't fade. He slowly rose to his feet, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision. Well, he said, glancing toward Coleman. Looks like our little game is over. Coleman, too overwhelmed to speak, merely lowered his head as another agent moved to detain him. As the two men were escorted out, the tension in the room lifted, replaced by the quiet hum of realization. This was a new beginning. Lisa Grant exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. James Connor crossed his arms, letting out a low chuckle. Emma Carter, standing by the door, caught Ethan's gaze and gave him a small nod of quiet pride. It was over. Later that evening, as Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, he took in the city sprawled out before him. The battle had been won, but the war against corruption never truly ended. Emma stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan gave a small smile but didn't take his eyes off the skyline. For now, because if this ordeal had taught him anything, it was that power was never static. It shifted, adapted, and found new hands to rest in. But as long as there were people willing to stand against it, there would always be hope. And tonight, at least, justice had prevailed. And just like that, justice was served. This story isn't just about a greedy salesman or a corrupt executive, it's about integrity. About standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Because power and deception might win in the short term, but the truth always has a way of coming out. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed corruption like this in real life? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that expose lies, reveal hidden power plays, and prove that justice can prevail.